looking at eternity, this is actually one of the difficult topic to explain. Right now, in the first look, it is easy. Well, God is eternal, right? That means it's easy to understand that God has no beginning and no end. It's just easy to say. But when what is a theologian? A theologian is someone who is able to explain what it is from, with a proper logic, right? In a proper way. So it's not only simply, it is easy to say God is eternal, but it is hard to explain the meaning of the eternity. So let's look at the idea of eternality of God. Definition: as the eternal God, God is the author of time, and his existence cannot be measured by time. The past, present, and future are possessed by a God in one indivisible person. Okay, so that is a mouthful of words. Actually, when we talk about the eternity of God, we say, as eternal God, God is the author of time, right? He is the author of time, which means what? What do we mean by God is the author of time? God created the time, right? God created the time. Remember, I said in the first second, right? When the earth began to move, the first second happened, right? God is the author, but we are going to see exactly what is time, right? What is time? Needs to be we need to understand. And when we talk about eternity, his existence cannot be measured by time. That means God has no past, present, future. Because past, present, future are actually some kind of succession of events, right? So we say God lives in one indivisible present, one indivisible present. Time, so let's look at what is time. As we know, it is marked by succession of events. So a question is asked, what is time? What is time? Time is marked by succession of events. With God, succession does not exist. There is no succession for God, right? God is above the time. God is above the time. Man can be said to be above time in a very finite sense. Maybe he can maybe desire to be above the time, but we are not above time. We are under the time, right? Because we have a past. Yesterday, our class about God's omnipresent was a past event. And tomorrow, what we are going to do is going to be future events for us. So we are under the time. But God is above time in an actual sense. God is not part of the universe, right? What is universe? Let's ask. What is universe? All that is there except God. All that is there except God is part of universe, right? So God is not part of universe. God is the author. God is the creator of the universe, right? So what, again, we have to understand, therefore, God has no past, present, and future. Past and present future is a measurement right? Measurement that we use to measure succession of events, right? Succession of things that takes place in this world. For example, we know that in the morning there is sun, rise up. Of course, it is because of the earth revolves that, but what we see is the rise of the sun. Evening, we see the setting of the sun. So, what we need to understand is that God is not under the time, because time is for the universe. God is above the time. God has no past, present, or future because God is not bound by time. For God, everything in a theology would call one indivisible present. All right, that is hard to understand, but at least something we have for us to think. Let's look at biblical proof. Okay, biblical proof. Number one, God. Okay, we have taken a verse from Genesis chapter 21, verse 33. God is the God of ages, right? God of ages. See, God of the ages. Look at that one. And the word that we use is El Olam. El Olam. It is not only, that when we see the word Olam, it is also says that God is the Lord of time. God is the Lord of time. Okay? The next one, Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. This is a famous verse, right? The encounter with between God, Yahweh and Moses. And Moses asked the question, when Pharaoh asked me, what should I say that your name? And God first names himself, right? What is the name that God gave? I am, right? I am the name that God gave. And giving some indication of his being a living person. But also it is his relationship to time, right? The word I am actually has come from Hebrew word haya, okay, haya, to be, right? So we say the word Yahweh has a connection to the eternality of God. What I have to understand, right? Now, if you read John chapter 8, verse 50, it will be interesting how Jesus Christ says, right? Can one of you please open your Bible and help me to read this verse? All right. Gospel of John chapter 8, verse 58. Gospel of John chapter 8, verse 58.
I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am.
All right. Jesus could have said, I existed before Abraham, right? I existed before Abraham. All right, before Abraham. Now, did Jesus say like that? Jesus did not say like that. Jesus simply said, what did Jesus say? Can you read one more time? Before Abraham.
Before Abraham was born, I am.
He didn't say I existed before Abraham. Before Abraham was born, I am. So that is clearly, it is what Jesus is saying. I am was always there. It is not that Jesus was or God, Yahweh, is bound by a time, right? So what we need to understand, when God names himself and says, I am, this is actually, gives some indication of his being a living person, but also his relationship to time. He exists in an eternal now. Eternal now. That means God has no past, right? No past, no future, no present, no future like we know, because these are all part of time. All are part of time. For God, only one eternal present, right? Right? Or we call an eternal now. It's hard to explain, right? Why it is hard? Why it is hard? It is hard because we can never imagine anything without time. Without a time, that is a problem, right? So that is a difficulty we have. Now let's look at Psalm 90 verse 2. Psalm 90 verse 2, we read, before mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, right? Before the mountains were born, you brought forth the earth and the world. Before you created everything, before the time began, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God, right? Everlasting to everlasting, you are God. God was always there, right? There was no beginning and no end. That is absolutely true. Now, let's look at another verse. Please read this verse also for me. This is very important. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7.
So we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began.
All right. Okay, before time began. You see? That's the first time, maybe this is a verse that is where it clearly says time has got a beginning. Time has got a beginning, but God's decree extends. So there are decisions that he has taken, and that decisions that he has taken has nothing to do with the time, right? So, which is very interesting, very interesting. Now, we have a famous verse here. Look at this one. Many times, not only in the Old Testament, and especially in Revelation, this comes, right? I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord. Then look at the explanation. Who is, who was, who is to come, the Almighty, right? So this is a verse that says, past, this is the past, this is the present, this is the future, right? This verse actually explains that, to just help us to know that, yes, God is eternal, but the idea is that, with a human viewpoint, how do you explain, right? This is what a human viewpoint, this is what God is, God was, God is to come, right? That's a human view. Human being looks at God and say, who was there, who is now, who will be there, right? Who will be there. So that is what we understand. We need to understand. So biblical proof, we looked at the verses. So now let's look at qualifications, right? First of all, we need to define what is time, right? Time is a system. Time is a system of measurement marked by succession of events in a changing universe. That is interesting, right? Universe is always changes, right? Universe changes. It is a changing universe, right? Yesterday is not today. Today is not tomorrow. So you have succession of events, right? Some of the things repeat, some of the things do not repeat, but events are taking place because the immutable God exists outside of his transient universe, right? Remember, again, let me help you to understand what is universe. All right, what is universe? Everything that is there except God is part of universe, right? God is not part of universe. So what we understand, immutable God exists outside of this changing universe, transiently changing universe. It is necessary to say that he also exists outside of time, as we know, because time began when God created. God is not part of time, and God is not under the time. We are, right? We are not above time. God exists outside of time. Okay? Now, some passages above convey something temporarily linear sense, reflecting the vantage of human author. For example, who was, who is, and who is to come, right? And so there are ways that you explain. And some of the verses that we read about God that we saw when we talked about God is omnipresent. There are a few verses we saw that God is like a human being. His actions are like human being. These should be regarded as instances of anthropomorphism, right? Remember yesterday we looked at that one, right? God's hand, God's ear, God's eyes. God is not merely everlasting. God is not merely everlasting. That means he exists at all times, but he is also eternal. He exists outside and above time. So I try to make a slight difference here. And that difference is everlasting and eternal. God is not merely everlasting, that he lasts forever, right? If you use the word forever, right, that's a humanistic term to tell without end, forever. God lasts forever. No, that is, yes, he exists at all times, that is sure. Not only that, he's eternal, right? So when we say everlasting, let me make it clear. Yes, from beginning till the end, right? Beginning till the end. If there is something like that, God exists. Okay, God exists throughout, right? God exists throughout the time, right? But he's also eternal. Now, the word eternal actually suggests it's much more than everlasting, in that he's outside and above the time. God is not within the time. God exists outside, right? So I'm trying to say some of the things again and again so that we might get some idea what we talk what we say when we talk about eternity. All right. That God, then one more qualification, that God does not regard time as we do, right? God does not regard time as we do. We will discuss this verse later. And does not mean that he cannot interact with temporal beings, or that he's careless in his expression of temporal realities, right? What is temporal? When we say temporal, things that are taking place in this temporal world, right? In this universe. So what we are saying, that God does not regard time as we do. Yes. Remember this is a verse for God. 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years, right? We will discuss that verse a little, as we progress here today. But which means that God does not regard time as we do. The way that God looks at time may not be the same way how we look at it. Right? But that does not mean that he cannot interact with his temporal beings, the beings, human beings, or that he is careless in his expression of temporal reality. No. Right? A day is like 1,000 years to God, and 1,000 years like a day does not mean that God is incapable of differentiating between a day and a millennium, or he is capricious in his use of temporal designations. No. See, God can understand time. Now, so the point is, don't think that because he is above time that he does not understand time, that he is not able to interact with temporal being. Right? No, that's not the point. God knows the time because he knows everything that he has created, including the time. Okay. Wow. So we looked at the qualifications, right? What is time we looked at? We looked at God does not regard time as we do. We also looked at that. But that does not mean that he cannot intervene in the universe and his creatures. Now, let's have some objections, right? Objections to the eternity of God. Eternity of God. Timelessness is a Greek philosophical concept, not a biblical one. That is the first objection, right? Timelessness is a Greek philosophical concept, not a biblical one. Yes, that is right. Now, while Pythagoras and Parmenides and Plato developed an advanced concept of timelessness well before the concept appears in the theology of the church. And the idea is not, right, without biblical precedent. Now, so that is right. The idea of timelessness has actually propagated by Pythagoras and other people, right? So that is the first objections, right? Okay. This is the first objection here is that timelessness is a Greek philosophical concept, not a biblical one. But what we are trying to say is that, yes, it was there in the philosophical writings, that is sure. But now we are looking at this verse that we already read, that God existed before time. So, if Paul says that God existed before time in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7, it does not make sense apart from the idea of timelessness, right? If there is an idea of timelessness, and if there is no idea of timelessness, then this verse will not make any sense, because Paul says God existed before time. So that means Paul knew the idea of timelessness. Not for an instance, Augustine, his commentary. If you are before time, it is not in time that you preceded. All right? So you proceed, if you are before time, then you proceed not in time. If this were so, you would not be before time. If you proceed before time, if you are talking about the past of God, right? Past of God, then that means God is within the time, right? We are saying past of God means then there is a present of God, then there is a future of God. So God is not under the time as we see, and he's not this past, present, future in a sense. That's not the way God exists, because this is only for us. What we say is that, as we see a present now, something like that, God is in an eternally present, eternally present, right? There is for God only there is an eternal present, right? There is no past, because for God is not bound by this events that is taking place here. Okay, so that's how Augustine explains. All right. Now, a certain nature of God's decree, at a minimum, strongly suggests timelessness. What is that? Let's look at this verse in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6. It's not only in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, but it is there in Romans chapter 8. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6. Can one of you read? Ephesians 2, verse 6.
And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus.
All right. Which is, remember, Romans chapter 8, verse 30. Those whom he foreknew, he predestined. Those whom he predestined, he called. Those whom he called, he justified. And those whom he justified, he glorified. Right? Glorified. Of course, yes, sometimes we explain it as a proleptic. Proleptic. The idea of proleptic is that for God, it is a sure thing, right? Your salvation is completely sure. That is, therefore, God would say, those whom he foreknew, he predestined. Those whom he predestined, he called. Those whom he called, he justified. Those whom he justified, he glorified. So the idea of glorification, we know that it's not yet happened, right? Not yet happened, right? It is going to happen in the future. But here in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, we read, God, what did he do? Can help me one more time? Can you read?
And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus.
Yeah. Seated us with Christ in the heavenly realm. In the heavenly realm. Wow. So, which is also a kind of, people would say it's a, same surety, assurance, proleptic sense. But I would say this verse reflects more than that, right? Yes, it is right. God has, this salvation is sure, for no doubt. But if God has decreed something, right? Why God has decreed it this way, right? It is also the reason for in God's mind, this salvation is not really, it is only for us. Jesus has to come, live, die, and rise again and ascend. But in God's mind, this succession is actually as if happened, it's happened already, right? Because for God, it is so sure that he can tell that we are seated, right? It is from a God's vantage point. He can say that it is happened, because God is not bound by the succession of events. Yes, for us, there was a day that we are saved. And there are years of Christian life we have. And one day we will die and we will go, right? And then there will be a resurrection and we will be resurrected. Yes, I understand. All right, we have the succession of events. But for God, who is not bound by time, who is not, is not going through the succession of events, can clearly say that yes, seated in heavenly places. It is clearly he could say. Okay, God's attribute also seem to reflect both quantitative and qualitative distinction. God's other attributes reflect both quantitative and qualitative distinction between man and God. His immutability especially seems to demand the absence of temporal succession. All right. So our point for the objection, timelessness is Greek philosophical concept, not a biblical one. I would say not really. Yes, we accept that Pythagoras and Plato all developed this concept, but it is not a concept that is not in the Bible. It is there in the Bible, right? We looked at it. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 7 is a very clear example that God existed before time, right? If that is the case, that means God is not bound by time, right? There was a time when there was no time, if we can say, there was a time and there was no time, not a time. I mean, because we are human beings, that's the only way we can measure, only way we can say, right? Because since time has a beginning, that means we are saying there was a time when there was no time at all. That is so. Some people would say an eternity for our understanding. People would say eternity past, eternity present, and eternity future. Okay. Well, eternity has no past or no present or no future. Actually, the way that we look at what people would say. Anyway, second objection. God must not be timeless since he acts and reacts within time. Wow. That's an argument. God must not be timeless since he acts and reacts within time. That is, God created, afterward declared to be good, right? Afterward. Genesis 1 verse. So he prepared the prophets for their ministries before they were born. So, right, he acts and reacts within time. That is the objection. Okay, so how do we explain this one? Now, God immutably and eternally decrees, right? Immutably and eternally decrees without a time. What will occur in time, right? God decreed means what? God commanded these things to happen in time, actually before time. That is to say that while he manifests himself in time, yes, right, you know that in the beginning, the word in the beginning is the time when the time began, right? In the beginning, when you say that word, Bershid, in the beginning, that is a time where the time began. Now, but remember, all those things happened in Genesis chapter 1, like God created the heavens and the earth, and God creates everything on the earth. It is actually decreed already, but it manifested in time. These actions represents no actual change or succession in God. That God is not bound by time does not restrict him from manifesting himself in time. What is that? All what you see is how God manifests, reveals himself in time. The creation and consummation, right? Creation and consummation. For God, it is actually who is about time, not bound by time. It is actually from creation to consummation. Everything is decreed. It is set. It is decreed. Everything is determined, right? And what is happening now, those decreed events are being manifested. That's what God manifests, reveals to us in time. All right. So what we understand here is that that God is not bound by time, does not restrict himself, um, or restrict him from manifesting himself in time. All right. Just as he manifests himself in space. Just as he manifests himself in space. All right. So what we are here to understand is that what you see in Genesis chapter 1 is what God has decided before the time began. God is revealing, right? It is revealing everything, manifesting everything. Okay, that is the thing. So the objection is God must not be timeless. He is time bound. That is the objection, since he acts and reacts within time, right? Now, and they bring an example also. That is from Genesis 1 verse 31, that God created and afterward declared to be good. So God reacts within time. Now, the answer to that is this: God immutably and eternally decrees without a time what will happen, what will occur in time. We already saw that, Ephesians chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 7, God decreed before time. So that means God existed before time, right? God existed before time. That means God decreed things before time. So, which is also now, therefore, us to understand here that what you see is the manifestation, right? God manifests himself in time, right? These are not actually change or succession in God. God doesn't change, right? We know the immutability of God. God doesn't change because God is not bound by time to change. All what we saw yesterday, God only, changes in time with the dealings with his people, right? Who are always changing, right? That's we already saw yesterday. Third objection. The incarnation presents, now this is the difficult place when we talk about eternity of God. Right? The most difficult thing, I would say. The incarnation presents an inseparable barrier to divine timelessness. Christ is clearly not timeless in that he became in time what he was not in eternity. And this new divine manifestation continues permanently into an interminable temporal future, right? Okay. Further, if timelessness can be predicated of God, then Christ is being eternally humiliated and killed in a timeless now, which is unconscionable. All right, unconscionable, like something that you cannot even think. All right, let me read again because this is a little difficult. So, for your understanding, I think we need to read it again. What is the objection? Right, the objection about the timelessness of God is taken from the incarnation. Right. incarnation is the biggest barrier to divine timelessness. That is what they say. Christ is clearly not timeless. That means Christ is time bound for sure. That is the argument. Christ is time bound. In that he became in time what he was not in eternity. And this new divine manifestation is, continues permanently into interminable temporal future, right? Because his incarnation is an issue, right? So further, if timelessness can be predicated of God, then Christ is being eternally humiliated. If you say Jesus Christ was timeless, right, then all those things that happened to Jesus Christ was before God, when there was no time, right? Because God is not bound by time. So Christ faced all these things in eternity. So that means his suffering was an eternal. His humiliation was an eternal, timeless. So how do you explain? Right? That is the maybe a toughest question to look at. Let's look at the answer. This is the most difficult tension for the idea of divine atemporality, timelessness. But it is not a hopeless one. In keeping with the answer immediately above, we overhear that there was no point of time in which the second person of Trinity was unconscious of the idea of incarnation and unwilling to take on humanity. Even when there was no time, second person of the Trinity was not, as if he was not aware of what? The idea of incarnation. It was not like that. He was aware of it. He knew it. Even when there was no time. Even when there was no time, when the Trinity existed in that eternal timelessness, the second person in the Trinity was aware of the need, the aware of incarnation. Further, it is important to note that God did not technically become a man. And sometimes we might, without thinking, we might say that one, right? God did not technically become a man, but rather he took on humanity, right? We say he added, right? Added humanity. It is not that God technically became man. That means he ceased to become God. He's simply a man. No. Even when he was here, he was not simply a man alone. He was God even when he was here, right? So, but rather took on humanity. Incurring no essential change in himself. Okay, in himself. As such, the action of incarnation presents no more difficulty than any other divine action. So, what we need to understand is that the objection of timelessness is one of the issue for many, in that say Christ was clearly not timeless. That is what their argument, right? If he was really timeless, then Christ's humiliation and his healing was also timeless, right? And which is cannot even think or fathom. That is what they say. Now the answer would be is this: yes, there was no we offer that there was no point of time in which the second person of Trinity was unconscious of the idea of incarnation. Even the so-called eternity past, right? We say eternity past. Even in this eternity past, the second person of the Trinity was aware. He was conscious, right? Conscious of his incarnation. He knew, right? He knew. He was conscious about his suffering. He was conscious about the death on the cross. He knew everything. But one thing we need to understand, when he came here, he did not come here as a mere man. He did not come. He simply added. The incarnation means enfleshment. The idea is adding flesh, right? Adding humanity. So therefore, the divine logos is also taking the form of human being. So that's how this is. So it is not a big change for Jesus Christ. All right. As such, the actual incarnation presents no more difficulty than any other divine action, because it is as if God decreed to create everything in Genesis 1, and he manifested everything in time, just like that God decreed to be incarnated. It was also to God's plan that Jesus Christ will be born and Jesus Christ will die. We will die. It's not a difficult thing for God. All right.
Pastor, one clarity. The objection is, hello. The objection is that since Christ is outside the time as part of Trinity, he has experiencing this humility for eternity. That is the objection.
Yeah.
Objection is that because he is timeless, the humility that he has undergone is also timeless. Now the answer to that is not very clear.
Okay.
Answer is, how are we answering that? The answer is that even though he is timeless, this part is limited, because only as long as he has incarnated, he has added flesh, only till that time period this humiliation is present. After that, it is not present. Is that the argument?
One of the biggest argument, one of the biggest thing for us to think along with that is that God was not, second person in the Trinity was not a God man in eternity, right? See, this suffering, humiliation, everything decreed, predicated only when he adds the humanity, right? Only when he adds the humanity, right? So it is not as if God suffers, right, in eternity. It's second person suffers. That's no. This is only happening when he takes adding humanity. Now let's look at one more time exactly what is the argument, right? Christ is clearly not timeless in that he became in time what he was not in eternity, right? Yes. In this new divine manifestation continues permanently into an interminable temporal future. Further, if timelessness can be predicated of God, then Christ is being eternally humiliated and killed in a timeless now. That is the argument. Now, if timeless can be predicated to God, Christ is God, so he's eternally humiliated, right? That is the argument. Now, how can we answer? Now, we are not answering as if, or we are not saying that Christ's humiliation is part of his divine being. It was not a part of his divine being, right? Christ's humiliation happened happened when he added humanity, right?
So only it is this humiliation exists only as long as he added humanity. After
Yes,
that, it ceases. So only 33 years of his
the humiliation, yes,
humiliation sustains.
sustains.
Thereafter, it doesn't, because he leaves humanity and goes back to
No, no,
divinity.
no, 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 not exactly like that.
Sorry.
Not
He
exactly like
discards
that.
discards
There is a
the
great change. He's resurrected.
he discards humanity.
Right. What? No, not even he discards. That, well, not exactly like that. We are not saying that Christ is not. So Christ was God in eternity. Now Christ became God man, right? Now that means Christ has got a body now, right?
Yeah,
Christ
what
has got
he
a
added, he has
right?
taken
A
it off.
body is added. Now, Christ, are we going to say Christ will not have a body after the ascension? No, he has got a resurrected, glorified body, right? Right? Glorified body, like we all have, all right? A glorified, he's going to have a glorified body, but it is not in a humiliated state, because that humiliation and that pain is gone when he died. Right? The manifestation. Now, but here is the thing, then let's also think, doesn't mean that Christ will never remember about his suffering. Not at all. Even in eternity, it is going to be there, right? But it is for us. It is expression of his love. So what actually happened, that this humiliation. Now, if you look at Philippians chapter 2, right? Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 on, if you read that he emptied himself, and he was obedient until death. That's what you read, right? So the humiliation that is happening only in his, because he added humanity, right? He added humanity. Christ was not, there was no humanity for Christ in the eternity past, right? So it is not an issue for us, because this is all this humiliation. Of course, it is decreed in Revelation chapter 3. You will read, he was the Lamb of God from the foundation of the world, right? So the death of Christ is definitely was decreed in the past, right? But this humiliation actually happens only when it began only when he was incarnated. Only when he was incarnated. So it is not an issue it was not actually an issue. And another thing, all these decreed events are definitely, it is part of, decreed events are, God decreed all these events, and for God there is no succession of events, right? Which we have already seen. But these events are manifested in time for us. We looked at that also. But as far as Christ's suffering is concerned, it is also decreed and it is manifested in time. But Christ, as second person in the Trinity, doesn't have to suffer eternally, right? It's not a suffering eternally, because Christ's divinity was not bound by time. He doesn't have to, because that's part of humanity. It's part of humanity. So that's how we say. Okay, now I just wanted to bring some practical values, and then we will close this one. All right, there are okay. Number one, from Deuteronomy, there is a verse, Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 21. There are everlasting arms, right? Everlasting arms in times of crisis. All right, everlasting arms in times of Christ. Second verse is taken from Psalm, which is very famous. Moses wrote, there is comfort in the midst of the brevity of life, even when you know your life will end before you reach the promised land. Moses was writing, right? There is a comfort, right? There is a comfort because, yes, there is eternity waiting for us. Another thing from Psalm 102, unlike all other gods, psalmist would say, though we will die, God will not die. God will not die, right? So those are the few practical values for life as we study. All right. This is the, as I said, when I began, I said eternity is one of the easiest thing for people to talk, right? Say, okay, God is eternal being, but this is one of the difficult concept to explain in theology, how timelessness and God is not bound by time, God is not under the time. How do we explain that one? Okay, so